Here we have a video for English Literature A-Level with students that are studying the Taming of the Shrew for the Aspects of Comedy module. In this video, I'm going to be discussing what happens in both scenes of Act 2 and also give you some key quotes alongside that. Talk about as well the significant aspects of comedy that we see, the relevance to what we see in relation to the comedic tradition. I'll also be in this video talking about some contextual information for AO3 and also for AO2, analysing some passages of language, but also talking about the staging and what is known as dramatic methods, which is really the stagecraft and what we see on the stage. So let's talk first about Act 3, Scene 1. So we're going here through a summary. Now, Act 3, Scene 1 is one of the shortest scenes in the whole play, actually, and it's concerned with the subplot. And for the entirety of this scene, we have three characters on stage, Lucentio, Hortensio, and Bianca. By this point, Lucentio and Hortensio have transformed into school tutors. Lucentio becomes Cambio and Hortensio becomes Lucio. And this reinforces the theme of transformation, which we have been seeing consistently since the beginning, since the induction, and which we continue to see throughout the whole of the play, really, whether it's emotional or physical transformation. And it shows us that swapping clothes creates that disequilibrium and a deviation from normal behaviour. The characters know they shouldn't really be doing this, but they do it anyway in the pursuit of a love interest. And comedy is all about how characters achieve a love interest and the farce and the absurdity by which they do so. It also reminds us that the disguise this is, that comedy is all about creating confusion and plot complexity. It's about creating dramatic irony, because we have to remember as an audience, of course, who's who, and also why they're doing it as well. And it also shows us that disguise is all about characters crossing socio-economic boundaries. Masters can become servants, and servants can become masters. I'm thinking here, for example, of Tranio and Lucentio swapping clothes. Both men are rivals to Bianca's love, because they are both potential, well, they are suitors, both potential husbands. And they have both opted to deceive and get to Bianca illegitimately under the guise of a school tutor, which would have been much more common in Shakespearean times because girls didn't go to school, I think, after the age of 10. So it was very common for fathers, if they could, to employ school tutors to continue the tutoring at home. So this would not have been something strange like it might be today, when many of us don't actually have school tutors at home. And we obviously know what's going on because we've watched the whole thing, so we know what the characters are doing, but they may not. And that creates that dramatic irony, it makes it highly entertaining, and it also means that we feel quite superior as an audience because we know more than certain characters on stage. In red for these slides we have some perhaps key quotes, and you can tell here the way in which Lucentio and Hortensio insult each other at the beginning of this scene shows that rivalry, and rivalry again is a common aspect of comedy, particularly between men who are trying to outdo each other in the pursuit of a female for a relationship or marriage. As the scene develops, you will know, if you've studied the play, that Bianca opts to tell the men herself that she will not be dictated to. She really does start to become more empowered than we perhaps gave her credit for in the beginning. Hortensio is told to go and tune his instrument, and he walks to the side of the stage, which is important because that means that Lucentio is able to be with Bianca himself and begin his wooing, I suppose, under the guise of providing a Latin lesson. So Lucentio is supposed to be teaching her Latin, and Hortensio is supposed to be teaching her music. And you can see there in the red, in that first point, how Bianca begins to talk. She is much more defiant than perhaps she would have been in the beginning, in Act 1. As Hortensio is tuning his instrument, as he's done as he's told, it's at this point that Lucentio reveals his true identity to Bianca. So from this point on, she knows that Lucentio has gone to extreme lengths to woo her. In terms of dramatic methods, he speaks, his revealing of his true identity is hidden in a Latin note, half of which is in Latin and half of it is in English. He says the Latin bits very loudly and he almost whispers the English bits. So from Hortensio's perspective, it sounds like he's genuinely teaching her Latin, but obviously that's not what he's doing. Bianca chooses Lucentio as her suitor, and in some versions at this point they do in fact embrace and kiss, which means Hortensio is regarded now as almost the unsuccessful candidate. He tries to woo Bianca himself in a piece of music, a musical scale called a gamut, but it doesn't go very well. She rejects him relatively quickly, and that means that Lucentio is left as the only suitor because Gremio, by this point, has also been outbid in the previous scene by Tranio in disguise, who's obviously pretending to be Lucentio. So Lucentio at this point is the last man standing. So that is what happens in Act 3, Scene 1. As I said, it's a very short scene, but it develops the subplot before the wedding scene in the next bit of the play. So because it's a short scene, we don't have that many staging decisions. This is obviously AO2. So AO2 can include language, but it can also include the logistics of the stagecraft. So entrances and exits, who speaks, who doesn't, props, costume, music, anything at all that an audience gathers meaning from. So the use of the musical instrument as a prop to distract Hortensio while Lucentio woos could be something to talk about. The staging, so often Bianca is stood between two men, suggesting they're both competing for her. So the physicality, the body language reflects that rivalry and competition. Quite farcical to some extent that both men are in disguise to do so as well. Use of clothing to reinforce the theme of transformation, but also disguise and disequilibrium. I've already done a video about that, about disequilibrium, which is quite important in comedy. And also the way in which Lucentio skillfully and resourcefully reveals his true identity to Bianca by shouting the Latin lines but whispering the English bits in his note, again suggests that he's able to maintain that deception and Hortensio is completely oblivious, even though we as an audience know what exactly is going on. So that is Act 3, Scene 1, a very short scene. Act 3, Scene 2 is a lot longer because it's now back to the main plot, the Kate and Petruchio plot. And this is also known as the wedding scene. So here, in this scene, the majority of characters are on stage, they're waiting outside the chapel, and they're waiting for Petruchio to arrive, who is late to his own wedding. Remember that he is the one that sets Sunday as the wedding date in Act 2, Scene 1, at the end of his wooing with Kate for the first time. So it's a bit ironic that he's late to his own wedding, even though he set the date. The church as a setting is important because it's supposed to be serious and it's supposed to be quite solemn. And yet, the formality is completely broken because of Petruchio's conduct and behaviour when he does arrive, which we'll talk about in a second. Kate is wearing her wedding dress, and it's a traditional white wedding dress, and she's angry and upset, and she also feels quite humiliated because Petruchio is late. Remember, she didn't even want to marry him in the first place, and yet here she is, showing that at these times, men often had the futures of the women in their hands. They were the ones that often dictated the futures of women and girls as well. And she runs off in stage in tears. Tranio says that Petruchio means well, they should cut him all some slack because he has good intentions. But of course he has to say that because he is relying on Petruchio to marry Kate, so Bianca is then accessible to Lucentio, who he's being very loyal to, of course. Remember, Baptista says in the opening scene, Act 1, Scene 1, that he intends to marry Kate off first, before Bianca. So Baptista, the father figure, represents the central problem in this play for Lucentio. How are they going to get to Bianca while Baptista is imposing that kind of barrier? So Tranio stands up for Petruchio because he needs Petruchio to play his part and, in effect, take Kate off the market, as it were. Just before Petruchio's entrance, Barndello arrives, and he says that he has seen Petruchio and Grumio arriving on their way to the wedding. Barndello is a Zanni character from Commedia dell'arte, so he's designed to provide comic relief sometimes. In some productions, he is regarded as not as quick-witted as some of the other men, so he often is a bit like Grumio. He provides the comic relief sometimes, and when he tells the other characters as well as the audience what he sees in terms of Petruchio's appearance, it's very farcical because in some productions he speaks very, very quickly and it becomes indecipherable at the end. So Barndello, in his relaying of what he's seen of Petruchio arriving, often creates comedy and the comic relief. And you have this kind of comic wordplay between Baptista, where there's some confusion about old news, new news, this kind of thing. In a climax of this scene, or at least one of them, Petruchio does arrive finally, but immediately we have the visual humour of what he's wearing. He's wearing, in effect, rags and clothes that are not befitting of this formal ceremony. His clothes clash with Kate's wedding dress, it clashes with the setting, it just clashes with everything that you would expect a formal wedding to be. So there's a huge disparity between his appearance and the supposed seriousness of the ceremony. He offers no explanation whatsoever as to why he's late, because he doesn't have one. He's clearly done it deliberately. But again, to add insult to injury, he then makes out that he is incredibly irritated that Kate is not there. And then he says, it's getting late. I don't have time to hang around, even though he was the late one. So again, you can see as the Il Capitano, he's very much in control of the stage. As soon as he enters the stage, it's always about him. He's quite narcissistic in that sense. There's a lot of talk about I's and my's for Petruchio. That's something to bear in mind when you have an extract potentially about him. Some characters suggest he should go and change. He refuses, and they all go off inside the chapel to see the wedding ceremony. And we don't see the wedding ceremony, which is why, a little bit later, we rely on Grumio. For that, all the characters leaving the stage to go into the church leaves Lucentio and Tranio on stage, and that allows them to plan and scheme their disguise. It develops the subplot. It reminds us that both of them are dressed as other people. And Tranio's loyalty is also emphasised when he says, "All for my master's sake, Lucentio." So all the other characters off stage means that these two can continue their deception in secret without anybody overhearing. Their conversation is ended by Grumio's entrance, and Grumio has been to the church, and he comes out looking white as a sheet, I think, because he is so shocked by what he saw and Petruchio's conduct in what is supposed to be a formal wedding ceremony. Petruchio's conduct is regarded as outrageous and audacious, deeply theatrical and opportunistic, because he's using constantly what's around him to his advantage. He's constantly looking for ways to show who's in control. Because we didn't see the ceremony, we rely on Grumio to give us a narrative of the events. And it's through Grumio that we almost visualise the scene inside the church when Petruchio, in effect, plays up, or subverting formality. So some of the things that he does: he swore in the church, he threw wine in the sexton's face, he hit the priest, the Bible fell on the floor, he turned up late, as we know, he wore terrible clothes, as we know, and he grabbed Kate so hard at the end, by the neck, in fact, and kissed her so hard that the sound of the kiss echoed throughout the whole church, and the onomatopoeia smack is used in the script, which sometimes recreates, obviously, the sound of that forceful kiss. So it's not very intimate, it's not very romantic, it's very forceful. And you have that alliterative phrase, mad marriage, which I think is quite a key phrase for this play. It's often a phrase that's printed on posters for Shrew, because it is all about this kind of mad marriage, isn't it? So Petruchio's conduct in the church really does subvert formality and create a lot of disequilibrium, because it moves away from, it deviates from expected behaviours and conduct in a formal ceremony like this. And then lastly, the last slide, which is all about the synopsis. Petruchio and Kate emerge together from the church. Obviously, now legally she is his property, and we'll talk a bit more about that in terms of context in a minute. And he makes it very clear that he intends not to stay around for a wedding reception or a party, and he wants to take Kate back to his house as soon as possible, where he obviously has control, and where Act 4 takes place, for 3 of the scenes anyway, because that's where the majority of the taming takes place, at his house. So it's no surprise that he wants Kate removed from all familiarity so he can begin to tame her at his house. Despite the characters trying to get him to stay, they're all unsuccessful, and he's so determined to leave, he doesn't give a reason why he has to go. He just says, if you knew why, you would understand why I have to go so quickly, but he doesn't give any explanation at all, because again, he doesn't really have one that he wants to say out loud anyway. His intention might be to tame Kate, but he might not want to say that publicly. Kate has now become one of his many possessions, and again, I love this phrase here, this asyndetic list of things that he has. My goods, my chattels, my house, household stuff, my field, my barn, my horse, my ox, my ass, my anything. That asyndetic list of stuff really reinforces the fact that she is now part of his possession, part of his possessions. And again, that repetition of the possessive determiner my, again, is very much to do with ownership, isn't it? And then it ends, really, with Petruchio and Kate going off together. She tends to leave screaming and kicking because she doesn't want to go. And he almost grabs her and removes her from Padua. And however, the party continues. So even though the groom and the bride are missing, Baptista says, oh, we'll just carry on without them. He gets Tranio to take Petruchio's place at the table. Baptista obviously thinks that Tranio is Lucentio, and he gets Bianca to take Kate's place at the table. So again, this reinforces how comedy is often about unity of time and place, about parties, about celebrations, about revelry and high spirits. And it also provides the comic relief to what we have just seen in terms of a quite humiliating episode for Kate. So that is what happens in Act 3, Scene 2. Because it's a longer scene, we have a lot more significant staging decisions to think about. Again, this is AO2, dramatic methods. Lots of characters on stage, creating unity of time and place. The setting itself, conflicting with Petruchio's ludicrous and ostentatious behaviour and conduct. The use of clothing and Petruchio's appearance to provide visual humour. And it's interesting that if you think about the induction, Christopher Sly goes from drunken tinker to lord. So he goes from kind of rags to riches. Petruchio goes the other way. Petruchio goes from rich man to poor man, at least appearance-wise, through the adoption of these rags. So it's interesting that transformation in this play works both ways in terms of status. Petruchio's entrance acts as a climax because we have been put on tenterhooks because of Barondello's narrative of events of his appearance, and now we see it for ourselves. But also maybe the climax of his and Kate's exit at the end, perhaps, because obviously we've been waiting for the marriage for a while. How Petruchio dominates the stage in terms of the Il Capitano stock character, Barondello's entrance, and the comic relief that he utters. We've talked about that earlier. Music is often used in this scene to frame the celebratory atmosphere, but also sometimes the musicians deliberately play the instruments out of tune, which reinforces the disharmony and dysfunctionality in their relationship. So when they come out of the church, the band, which is often above the stage or somewhere, can sometimes go out of tune to represent that dysfunctionality. Grumio's role as reporter of events, which builds the tension and keeps the audience in the loop with what happened inside the church, which obviously we don't see. Kate's wedding dress, which is clearly traditional, which conflicts with Petruchio's ridiculous garb, which means his outfit. The wedding dress obviously becomes soiled by the time we see Kate again in Act 4, Scene 1, because of the way she falls off the horse. So again, the tarnishing of that wedding dress shows the imperfection in their relationship, perhaps the dysfunctionality. And finally, remember that the subplot is also in this scene, how Tranio and Lucentio continue to scheme and plot their secret deception in terms of how Lucentio is going to get Bianca. So there's an awful lot going on in terms of the dynamics and the logistics of this staging. So whether it's an extract question or just a general question for Shrew, these things would all come under AO2. Also for AO2, think about who dominates the speech and who doesn't. Kate is now going, from quite outspoken Shrew in the first couple of acts to someone who doesn't really speak as much in the next for the rest of the play, really. So voicelessness and who dominates the conversation can also be something to talk about. To further AO2 can also, of course, include language analysis, and Shakespeare, as we know, offers some wonderful passages of language which we can analyse from a linguistic point of view. Here we have Grumio's testimony when he comes out of the church and tells Lucentio and Tranio what he has seen. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this, but just look at the verbs at the top there. We've got a pattern of 4 verbs. Trembled and shook versus stamped and swore. That really emphasises the difference in their personalities at this point and how Kate and Petruchio behaved in this church. Complete opposites in terms of connotations. And this is also where Grumio tells us about Petruchio's behaviour. We've got that onomatopoeia there that I was talking about, the smack of the kiss in the church, which isn't particularly romantic, and also the alliteration there of mad marriage, which is really the premise of the whole play. So, and also, Petruchio offers us some wonderful examples of language analysis as well, because Petruchio is a wordsmith. He's able to use his sharpness of mind and his resourcefulness and his intellect to really come out with some fabulous passages of language. And here we have their example of that. You've got a list here of verbs and adjectives in pink at the top, which really all go to the heart of what comedy is. Comedy is all about revelling and domineering, about carousing and partying and being mad and merry. So that's what he's saying to the guests they should do. You've then got an asyndetic list of these verbs telling her to behave, especially now that he's in charge post-marriage. And in some productions, the blue statement here, he actually shouts this. He actually shouts this declarative sentence: I will be master of what is mine own. Clearly meaning he is the husband, he has the control over her. And at this point, he's irritated because she has said, I want to stay with the wedding party. So she's contradicted him. And there always is some kind of consequence to that, whether it's shouting or some kind of trivial taming test. There's always going to be a consequence because he's training her, he's taming her. And it also links very nicely to the soliloquy that he gives at the end of Act 4, Scene 1, where he talks about the falconry idea, the metaphor of the falcon and being the keeper of the falcon, which is clearly animal imagery and a metaphor to do with the dynamic between them. We've already talked about the asyndetic list of possessions, and at the bottom there, the scene actually descends into chaos, really, because he makes out that people are trying to steal Kate away from him. So he grabs her and almost, yanks her away off the stage to his house. The irony, of course, is that that's what he's doing. He's stealing her away from her family and her where she's grown up. So the irony is there as well. So he wants to be seen as the heroic protector, when actually he's coming across as a bit of a lunatic. And it's part of his resourcefulness and this theatricality that he has as the Il Capitano character. He says to Grumio here, help me, Grumio, protect Kate from these thieves. When actually nobody wants to steal her, they just want her to stay at the party. So again, that's also AO2 there in terms of some language analysis. Finally, context for AO3. Again, context is really important. Don't just throw in context because you know it. It has to be relevant to what you're saying. It has to be relevant to your interpretative process. So don't just throw in or shoehorn in context. It has to be relevant. So what I've selected here are all relevant things that are to do with society at the time, which are relevant to Act 3, Scene 2, yes. So, as we know, women were seen as property to a man, highly patriarchal society, despite having a queen, Elizabeth I, men had control, women were expected to be obedient, particularly to any male authority, such as a father, brother, or husband. Women were not allowed to attend school, which is often useful for context for the first scene and the school tutors. Father controlled who the daughter married and when. Again, once upon marriage, the woman fell under the guardianship of the husband and from the father. So there wasn't really a point when they were independent. They went straight from father to husband and a different authority figure. Also, context that is relevant to perhaps the wedding scene or this kind of middle act, which is all about relationships forming. This is interesting because this is in terms of taming, and I make this clear all the time to students that the society that that existed in 1600, let's say, is very different to the society that we have now. So the audience that went to see Shrew 500 or so years ago had different experiences of the society that they were living in, and this is what we have to remember, that Shakespeare wasn't really writing for us in 2022 or modern times. He was writing for his own society because that's what he had experience of. So at the time, the audience would have been well aware of taming women because it was seen as almost like a cultural taboo. So women had their own set of punishments administered if they were not obedient to their husbands. Depending on the severity of their actions, talking back, gossiping, not obeying, being outspoken, they could receive a public punishment, and it could be very, very humiliating for them. So sometimes they could be bound and seated backwards on a horse and paraded through the streets, wearing a label that said, this is what I've done, and people would laugh and point at them and mock them. They could have also been placed on a chair and dunked into water for public amusement. It was also part of witch trials as well, to give the illusion of drowning. So it was quite vicious. And also, if women gossiped and talked back, they could often wear a scold's bridle, which was a cage that was placed over the woman's head with a metal rod that went into her mouth to suppress the tongue, so she couldn't speak. And again, she would be paraded through the streets for public ridicule. So at the time that this play was written, which was approximately 1592, one of Shakespeare's earlier plays that he ever wrote, part of a group of 4 actually that were published at the end of the 16th century. Society would have been well aware of this concept of women being humiliated by men, particularly if they were regarded as shrews or scolds. So we have to remember that these plays are historical documents. They're literary historical documents. They tell us about the society. That's why we study literature, because it tells us who we were, but it also helps us understand who we are now and where we want to be going in the future, what kind of society we want to be, what kind of people we want to be. That's why we study literature. So those are some AO3 points there. Now, of course, in terms of Shrew, Petruchio does not, and Shakespeare does not opt to revert to these kind of more, vicious modes of punishment. Perhaps there might be some in the audience that said that Petruchio was too soft on Kate. Maybe they wish he was a bit more aggressive with her. But Shakespeare in this play, of course, chooses to opt for more farcical, comedic dysfunctionality between Petruchio and Kate, rather than any physical violence, which would be even harder for us today to think about as an audience in terms of our own morals and our own outlook and perspectives on society. So Shrew is an ambiguous play, and I've taught Shrew now for almost a decade, and one of the reasons why it's an enjoyable text to teach is because of that ambiguity, how it shines a light back into the past, and how we react to it now, whether or not we view it as misogynistic or cruel or abusive. or whether we view it as just a piece of domestic farce and absurdity between man and wife. So again, some AO5 points there to do with our own perspective and our own relationship with Shrew. One of the questions that I asked students just to finish this video is, what does it say about us if we still laugh at this play? What does it say about us if we are still entertained by a woman being tamed? What does that say about us? Because it is one of the most common plays that is put on by the RSC, for example. Still, it's had about 6 productions in 15 years. So clearly it pulls in the punters, and I always wonder what that says about us as an audience. So that is a summary video about Act 3. This is for AQA English Literature Aspects of Comedy for A-Level, and I hope that was useful. Obviously on the front here, just to finish off, you can see that's an example of that punishment there with the cage over the head with the metal rod going into the woman's mouth. So that is what it looked like. So hopefully that's useful, and thank you for watching.